Welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into something that's always captured the public's attention, the evolution of federal political sex scandals right here in the US. We're going to look at the actual historical record to see how public accountability has drastically shifted, literally from the founding fathers right up to today.
Here's our roadmap for this explainer. First, we'll define what a political scandal actually is. Then, we'll look at early history and hidden affairs, explore the massive media shifts in the 1970s and 80s, and finally, we'll wrap up with the modern era and its evolving consequences.
All right, part 1, defining the political scandal.
So what actually makes something a true scandal? Well, it fundamentally boils down to a damaged reputation caused by a violation of morality or propriety. We aren't talking about pushing an unpopular policy here. We're talking about personal conduct that genuinely shocks the public conscience. And you know the real kicker? Often it isn't even the initial act that creates the massive fallout. It's almost always the cover-up and the hypocrisy that follows.
Moving right along to part 2, early history and hidden affairs.
You might be surprised to learn just how far back this stuff actually goes. I mean, severe moral controversies were happening right at the birth of the country. The personal was absolutely political back then, too. Take 1796. Alexander Hamilton was caught up in a major blackmail plot over an affair. A few years later, in 1802, the press was literally weaponizing rumors, with a journalist publicly accusing Thomas Jefferson regarding Sally Hemings. And jump to 1828, Andrew Jackson's presidential run was heavily marred by accusations of bigamy. So yeah, this is for sure not a new phenomenon.
Faced with that blackmail over his affair, Alexander Hamilton actually took a really surprising route. He didn't hide it. Once the blackmail payments were exposed, he issued a highly publicized apology and confession. Why would he do that? Well, he wanted to clear his name of financial corruption charges. He literally chose to sacrifice his private morality just to save his public political honor. Kind of wild to think about today, right?
Throughout the 19th century, the consequences for these actions were, well, completely unpredictable. In 1884, you had President Grover Cleveland paying child support during his campaign, which actually got his opponents chanting, "Ma, ma, where's my pa?" But it gets much darker. In 1859, Representative Daniel Sickles gunned down a man in broad daylight in Lafayette Square over an affair with Sickles' wife. And get this, he was acquitted using the country's very first temporary insanity defense. Meanwhile, other guys faced total political ruin, like Senator Richard Mentor Johnson, who lost his 1828 re-election simply because he refused to hide his common-law marriage. Okay, let's fast forward to part 3, the media shifts of the 1970s and 1980s. This is a massive turning point in our explainer because the press completely flipped their approach. Before the 1970s, the media basically protected the open secrets of the political elite. Presidents like FDR, JFK, and LBJ had documented extramarital affairs that journalists totally knew about, but they deliberately kept it out of the papers. But after the 1970s, that protective shield totally shattered. Extensive coverage became the absolute norm, and the public outing of politicians just skyrocketed. Just listen to this startling admission from Elizabeth Ray back in 1976. She was a committee staffer for Representative Wayne Hayes. The media ended up exposing that she was on the taxpayer payroll for 2 whole years as a clerk, when, in reality, her primary job was providing sexual favors to the congressman. This was the exact moment the media started aggressively linking illicit affairs directly to taxpayer dollars. It was a total game changer.
As the 70s rolled into the 80s, the focus shifted from mere gossip to serious criminal accountability. You had Representatives Bauman and Hinson facing criminal charges for solicitation. And then there was the highly disturbing 1983 Congressional page scandal, which exposed a gross abuse of power and led to criminal convictions for Representatives Dan Crane and Jerry Studds involving a 17-year-old minor. This wasn't just a political gaffe anymore. It was a statutory crime. And politically, nobody was safe. Senator Gary Hart literally had his 1987 presidential frontrunner status derailed overnight by photos of an extramarital affair.
Which brings us to part 4, the modern era and evolving consequences. This infamous television denial from Bill Clinton in 1998 changed the landscape forever. The president's affair led directly to perjury charges and a presidential impeachment. It really cemented a brutal modern political reality. It's almost always the cover-up, and specifically lying under oath, that brings way harsher legal and political consequences than the original act itself. Now, a huge recurring theme in the modern era is the severe punishment of hypocrisy. The media started actively juxtaposing a politician's strict public platform right alongside their private behavior. For example, Randall Tobias, who was appointed to combat global prostitution. resigned after being exposed as a client of a DC escort ring. Or you'd see politicians running on strict family values or pro-life platforms, caught soliciting sex or coercing partners into abortions. Voters basically started punishing the hypocrisy just as fiercely as the scandals themselves.
And we see this toxic power dynamic play out again and again. Representative Tim Mahoney actually admitted to placing his mistress on his congressional staff, and then he fired her with this exact quote, "You work at my pleasure." It perfectly highlights this recurring systemic issue of elected officials weaponizing their authority and taxpayer-funded payrolls to manage and silence their illicit relationships.
$84,000. That is the exact amount of taxpayer money Representative Blake Farenthold used via the House Office of Compliance to settle a sexual harassment complaint from his former communications director. When this leaked, it marked the very first documented case of taxpayer funds being used to settle harassment complaints against a member of Congress. As you can imagine, it sparked intense nationwide outrage. The public's tolerance for footing the bill for political misconduct had definitively hit absolute zero.
And that brings us to the profound impact of the #MeToo era. Now, we did see precursors to this back in 1995 with Senator Robert Packwood, but by 2017, the landscape had entirely shifted. A strict, zero-tolerance approach to workplace harassment rapidly forced numerous longstanding politicians to step down immediately. And this happened across the entire political spectrum, from Senator Al Franken to Representative John Conyers Jr. and Representative Pat Meehan. The days of just riding out a harassment storm were officially over. As we wrap up this explainer, we really have to look forward. We've gone from quiet cover-ups and deadly duels to aggressive media exposure, criminal accountability, and zero tolerance for harassment and hypocrisy. The bar for acceptable behavior is constantly moving. So, as technology advances and privacy shrinks even further, it leaves us with one critical question. What are the behaviors that the voters and the press of tomorrow will simply refuse to forgive? Thanks for joining me on this deep dive.